We've got a riveting discussion now. Multi-award-winning science fiction authors Cory Doctorow and Charles Stross come together to explore how fictional works can aid visions of the future.
So I want to start by saying that I think science fiction's relationship to the future is absolutely not predictive. And thank goodness. If the future is predictable, then it is arriving on rails. Nothing we do makes a difference. There is something incredibly fatalistic about the view that the future can be known, because it implies that human action is irrelevant to the future that we arrive at. And instead, I think science fiction is much more like an oracle. If you get all the people whose voices we're willing to hear from to write down their aspirations and fears about technology and its relationship to society, then all of the editors who are in a position to gatekeep those aspirations and fears choose among them and pick some that they think the public will want. And then the great public chooses among those, like an ideomotor response on a planchette on a Ouija board, and points towards one or more of those futures. And it doesn't tell you what's going on in the future in the same way that the planchette on a Ouija board doesn't tell you what's going on in the spirit realm, but it tells you an awful lot about what's going on with the audience, with the writer and with the audience. And this is why we see the periodic surge and retreat of, say, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or as it should be properly called, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein's monster, in which the various things that story can be about, hubris and technology run amok, and the power of technology to extend life, and foolishness and short-sightedness and whatever, all those different valences that story has. At different times, we feel them in different ways, and that story comes back again and again and again. It enjoys the remarkable advantage of being in the public domain, something that very few stories with any currency are, and so it can be very trivially revived when the moment comes for it. And to observe that science fiction is a good way to know about the present is not to omit science fiction's role in the future. The present is the standing wave in which the past is becoming the future. If you know a lot about the present, you know more about the future. You are better prepared for the future. And science fiction can be a kind of intuition pump that tells you what your reflexive view should be of different futuristic events when and if they arrive. And that also has an enormous impact on what kind of future we have, but not because it's been predicted, but because it's been inscribed upon our imaginations.
I mostly agree with everything Cory's just said about science fiction, but I'd like to add a few different angles to it. For starters, science fiction is, when all is said and done, it's commercial art. The job of a science fiction writer is to, above all, to tell an entertaining story. If you don't tell an entertaining story, well, you're a storyteller, you put your bowl out and people throw coins in it. You don't get paid. So, as it said on my blog for years, I tell lies for money. And you've got to bear in mind that if the lies are not entertaining, people won't give you money. So they have to play into the cognitive biases and expectations of the audience. And that's point number one, that science fiction isn't a unbiased guide to the future or to what we think the future will be. It's a selective guide. A second point here is we are always rooting our predictions about the future in the present. It's depictions of the future in science fiction are very much a reflection of the concerns and preoccupations of the present day, using the future as a dark mirror, as it were, to sort of examine our fears from a different angle. For example, if you read the works of Philip K. Dick, you don't have to go very, very far to stub your toes on the intense paranoia of the Cold War era in which he was writing. If you look at John W. Campbell's work, very famous, very eminent editor who shaped the genre immensely between the 1930s and the 1960s. Was it amazing that he was editing at the time? What he was publishing was to some extent selective for what pushed a political agenda. The classic science fiction short story, The Cold Equations, I'm trying to remember the author's name, having a senior moment here. It's the tale of a spaceman, this was sort of early 1950s, who on a shuttlecraft dropping off a starship that is passing a solar system, there's a colony in the solar system, it has a plague outbreak, he has a vaccine or a cure for plague, It's a very lightweight shuttle. There's not much margin of error. His job is to get the cure to the colony before everybody there dies. And he discovers a 12-year-old girl has stowed away on his ship. And spoilers abound, she dies because basically there's not enough fuel reserve to get there and complete the mission and take the weight of the stowaway. And apparently that's not the way the story originally ran. Campbell sent the story back to the author 3 times requesting a rewrite before he got it right, with the ending that Campbell was looking for, which was one that basically said you can't play games with the laws of physics. The other thing I'd like to note is I think this century it's been getting increasingly difficult to write predictive mode SF. I mean, most SF is actually metaphorical or it's escapist entertainment. It's rare to actually try and predict the future, although I have a couple of times written books in which I was attempting to portray a future 10 years out. I was writing police procedurals about computer-related crimes that don't exist yet, basically. And I came up with a recipe for trying to come up with a setting for such fiction. The first thing to recognize if you're setting a fiction 10 years in the future is that 90% of that future is already here today and it's around us. I'm in the UK. The average home in the UK is 75 years old. Our houses are really ancient. So it's a fair bet that in 10 years' time, about 80 to 90% of the housing stock will be the same. Cars, similarly. Cars these days last more than a decade. Half the cars on the road in 10 years' time are already on the road today. People are born, people grow old, people die, but we know that there'll be maybe 15% of those who are here today will be dead, another 15% will be around, and everybody else will be a bit older. But you can basically predict who will be there for the most part. So when I say the world in 10 years' time is 90% already here today, that's what I mean. But that leaves another 10%. And my formula back in the noughties, in 2005 to 2010, was 9% is predictable from roadmaps. For example, you can look at Intel's roadmap for where they're going with semiconductors or at ARMS and take a fairly good stab at the performance envelope of smartphones or laptop computers in 10 years' time. You know, this stuff is pretty much determined by the cadence of Moore's law, improvements in node size in semiconductor fabs, and similarly. You can look at medications that are in clinical trials and you'll be able to guess what's going to be there. But finally, there's another 1%, which is from the who ordered that department, which you just cannot predict no matter what happens. Take COVID-19, for example. Back in 1994, I read a book by Pulitzer Prize-winning writer Laurie Garrett called The Coming Plague, which pretty much predicted the emergence of zoonoses and viral pandemics that would hit the human population sometime within the next few decades. It's about as inevitable as another big earthquake hitting the San Andreas Fault. Nobody can predict when it will happen. You can just predict that it will happen. But the consequences of COVID-19 coinciding with an American president who would double down on selling bleach irrigation as a quack cure and denounce vaccination as a communist plot or something. Who ordered that? I mean, there is stuff that you just cannot put into a work of fiction and have anybody believe it. If I tried to write a zombie pandemic novel using events that had occurred during COVID-19, I would be having to have a large number of people be zombie denialists and a bunch of others holding zombie virus parties in which you too can be bitten early by a zombie to build up your herd immunity. The point I've been circling and trying to get to is back a decade or so ago, it was a 99.1% division between eminently predictable because it's already here, 9% on the roadmap, and 1% random, weird, crazy shit. And today I think it's more like 80% already here, 15% on the roadmap, and 5% out of the random junk drawer of a hallucinating god, basically. It is getting much, much harder to predict where we're going in the next few years because there's so much random stuff happening. Cory, any comments?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful formulation. And I was very struck when you posted that essay about the future being 90% here. It really made me think hard. And I take on board all you say about the nonlinear nature of some of the things that have happened in the last few years, the sense that we've been just horribly buffeted by very strange change that we didn't anticipate, or that we couldn't have easily anticipated. I think, though, that the hopeful side of all that is that if the future is not inscribed, right, if it's only 80% and falling, that represents the space in which human action might make a difference.
We tend to find it very, very difficult to get our heads around paradigm shifts. As Herman Kahn observed when he was writing about the structure of scientific revolutions, you usually have to wait for an entire generation of elderly scientists to die off before suddenly the orthodoxy shifts completely. And, for example, tectonic drift was hypothesized as an explanation in geology for why the distribution of fossils and strata in different continents seem to match up weirdly. It goes back to about the 19-teens to 1920s. It did not become the orthodoxy until the 1960s, but it then opinion shifted very, very rapidly in a period of about 10 years, as I understand it. Again, not a geologist here. This is my layman's understanding of it, which may be wrong. And I think the same goes with trends in economics as well. We're living at the end of about a 40-year experiment with neoliberalism, the roots of which go back 20, 30 years before that. And there's a strangely Brezhnevite late Soviet feel to the way economics is discussed in the West. It's particularly obtrusive in Brexit land, the UK. Brexit wasn't even on the political radar a decade ago. It was an internal esoteric squabble among some conservative ideologues that was ranked about number 12 on a list of public concerns. Do you want to leave the EU? About 4% of the population were interested in it, way below the health service, unemployment benefits, financial crisis. It was artificially hyped up and sold to the public as a solution to an entirely different set of problems, and that were amplified by a very right-wing reactionary media environment. And that represents a paradigm shift in the way British politics is best understood, one that is actually threatening to tear the whole of the UK apart. I am in Scotland, where polling for independence has now hit, opinion polls have a majority of the population willing to vote for independence. In Northern Ireland, it's getting close to that level. In Wales, which has been part of England and Wales for 700 years, 30 to 40% of the population want to leave the UK. I mean, this is ridiculous. This wouldn't have been on the radar 5 years ago, and it's a side effect of one of these very strange paradigm shifts, which has been largely driven by a goal of a large chunk of the British investment sector who want to turn the UK into essentially a tax haven. By getting out from under EU regulations on money laundering, by leaving the European financial system, they believe they can actually make bank as an offshore place where people will do the financial transactions and move all their deposits around. And it's representing a very weird paradigm shift in how the UK is perceived at different levels by its own establishment. It's no longer an imperial power. The empire pulled down the flag over Hong Kong in 1996. A generation later, we're now seeing them try and move their pet fiefdom, because they think of it as a country they own, in an entirely different direction for a different purpose. Where this is going to end up, I don't know, but my suspicion is it's going to end up as a whole bunch of small squabbling states with different agendas, some of which are going to go in very different directions.
So it's funny you mention money laundering. I think that one of the underappreciated areas and underexplored areas for science fiction is finance crime, and particularly we've had like a decade of just both literally and figuratively spectacular finance leaks, Panama Papers, Paradise Papers, Lux leaks, and so on. And these leaks have had huge political consequences and have included the kind of thing that you could really easily make into a science fiction novel, like assassinations, where journalists who reported on them in Malta was car bombed by thugs hired by rich people. And the thing that LuxLeaks and the other leak packages, as well as the works of economists like Gabriel Zucman and Thomas Piketty, his mentor, have revealed, is that most of the economy is an off-the-books economy. That the money is all kind of moving through these dark silos, and there have been ways that it has like extruded into the physical world. You walk through Mayfair and a third of the flats are dark of an evening because they're just safe deposit boxes in the sky. Same goes for the Shard and those other tall buildings. New York is the same.
I have a novel which is basically riffing on that. Okay, it's an urban fantasy and a political satire, but the whole point of real estate as investment vehicles rather than actual habitation is the armature of that whole thing. It's impossible to avoid. You can't tackle the present or the near future without acknowledging it.
Well, and then this brings me to a question that was raised by Haida Goody that Aaron was kind enough to stick in the chat here, which is views on non-fungible tokens. And I think that there's a bunch of obvious things to say, like they're a climate disaster and they're stupid. But there's another thing to say, which is that speculative markets that are vast and that appear out of nowhere and just go wild are the hallmark not just of a bubble, but also of a bubble being protective coloration for money laundering. And, certainly like the London property bubble was a money laundering bubble. Also
the bubble economy in Old Masters' great works of art.
100%. Yeah.
If somebody in the Saudi royal family buys a painting for $200 million, it's not worth $200 million, but it does mean $200 million can legitimately be converted into cash in another country.
Certain paintings can no longer be sold in the US because their true owners would then be disclosed and then be liable for taxation on the basis of it. When these paintings change hands, it is a market that looks a lot like the NFT market because it's a market in nothing. So most of these paintings are in climate-controlled shipping containers, secure shipping containers in the free port of Geneva. And when I buy a painting from you, all that happens is title is transferred from me to you. And the NFT market, what the NFT market is it's a market in you indelibly recording that a file at a certain web address is a file that you accepted some money in exchange for indelibly recording that there's a file at that address from me. That's all that we've done, right? You haven't transferred title to the image or the file. There's been no actual transaction that's taken place that produced social value. It is a market in attestations that the market exists. And it's an incredibly fragile one, or at least an incredibly fallacious one. If you want to understand just how fake the NFT market is, consider that the thing that you notionally buy is the permanent record of a web address, actually address in IPFS, the Interplanetary File System, which is a distributed file system. So Charlie, if you were to record yourself farting as someone just did and put it up for auction as an NFT and I bought it from you, what I would actually have is like a cryptographic hash that said this identifier associated with Cory Doctorow gave some money to this identifier belonging to Charlie Stross for a file at this address. But the thing is that the web host that hosts that address can disappear. And they do. There's been huge numbers of disappearing web hosts in the nascent NFT market where these servers that host the only part of this that is remotely a valuable thing, which is maybe someone will derive pleasure from the sound of a fart or a JPEG or an animated GIF, and it is pronounced GIF. I'll die on that hill. That part of it is completely fluid. There's no means of establishing its permanence, and indeed, quite the reverse. Because the blockchain entry is indelible, you can't update it. If the server goes down and they put the file somewhere else, you will forever point at a file that doesn't exist. It is a really remarkable piece of bubblenomics.
It's bubblenomics, and it makes less sense for the Dutch 18th century tulip bulb craze because at least tulip bulbs were physical things. And Cory finally got to the one word that I think renders it completely irredeemably toxic, which is blockchain. The problem is proof of work requires an exponentially increasing amount of energy to be expended on calculations. If blockchain was doing something useful like solving protein folding computations, I would at least have some time for it. But I can't help thinking, whenever I look at blockchain and Bitcoin in particular, this was designed by a libertarian ideologue of the traditional gold bug variety, who wanted specifically to undermine government's ability to issue fiat currency and to collect tax, and who wanted to provide a bypass specifically for tax avoidance, and didn't care about the damage that it would cause in the long term. It's grotesquely destructive, and it doesn't even do anything particularly useful for us. I'm sure we can come up with cryptocurrencies that don't destroy the environment in the process, or at least do something that we all agree is useful in the process of consuming huge amounts of energy. What I see is people who just get very, very enthusiastic about the latest collector's fad. And what were those collectible electronic pets from a few years ago?
Not Pokemon, Tamagotchi.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking of Tamagotchi specifically, but I was thinking of a later iteration where they're entirely virtual objects.
E-pets or something?
E-pets, yeah. It's glorified e-pets, and it's accidentally blown up into an economy of ridiculous size, and it's consuming the energy, roughly the same amount of energy as Austria or Argentina or somewhere at this point. Yeah. This has got beyond the joke.
And I think that this is that the only quibble I would have with that characterization is sort of out of the blue. I actually, or for some reason, I think that I hypothesize that there's a very good reason for the liquidity in this otherwise irrational market, which is that it is economically rational for money launderers who have stolen money and want to make it into clean money to participate in otherwise very wasteful markets. And,
yes.
And that is often the case. I will say, trying to channel my cryptocurrency friends, that they will say, oh, well, there's proof of stake, which is better and better for the climate, although there's been no meaningful action on it. And then there are new cryptocurrencies that rely on trusted computing and remote attestation, which it happens to be the theme of the other novel I'm writing right now, which is called Red Team Blues. And it's a book about a forensic accountant tracking down money launderers who steal secure attestation keys for the secure enclaves in phones, so that they can rewrite a cryptographic ledger to help them launder money, and the murders that kicks off. So I think that money laundering is symptomatic. To try and tie this back together, because we're coming low on time here, tie this all back together. The Libertarian Exit Project is a long project, right? The project of walking away from the peons who, there's far too many of them that are needed, strictly speaking, to keep our toilets clean. So most of them can just go hang, and finding a nation where you can write your own laws that acknowledge the divine right of markets and so on. That project is a very old one, and it's very intimately related to the cozy apocalypse, and it's very intimately related to the bunker building projects of the 21st century. And it is something that science fiction has been very kind to, that owes a great debt to science fiction, from Atlas Shrugged to Heinlein novels to all sorts of space exploration books. And that the project of taking money out of the hands of democratically elected legislatures and moving them to these distributed systems that are controlled by rich people, that is, I think, best seen as part of that project. I want to close it out then and say that your neighbors are the solution, not the problem. That the future is unknowable, and that's good. That the future is ours to inscribe. That it's not an individual project, it's a collective project. And that we will do it not through war of all against all, but through cooperation and collaboration.
I'm going to agree with all of that, and just add as well, when reading depictions of a future, always try and keep one eye on the cognitive biases of the author. What agenda are they trying to promote? What agenda are they taking for granted? That's about it from me, I guess.
Because we authors are frail mediocrities, just like everybody else.